2 cops dragged a black woman to a dock, her hands cuffed. They shoved her into the lake, holding her down until the bubbles stopped. They didn't know her brother was an elite rescue diver, and he's coming for them. The place they chose was called Serenity Lake, a name so cruelly ironic it felt like a line from a half-forgotten poem. That afternoon, the sun was a benevolent god, spilling liquid gold across a surface so calm it mirrored the sky in perfect, rippling detail. A soft breeze, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, drifted from the dense woods that ringed the water. From somewhere deep within the trees, a lawnmower hummed, a lazy, distant sound of summer normalcy. But on the old wooden dock that jutted out into the lake, there was no peace. The measured thud of boots on weathered planks was a heavy, deliberate rhythm, a funeral march for one. Between 2 uniformed men walked a young black woman, Amara Vance. Steel cuffs, cold and unforgiving, bit into her wrists with every nudge forward. She didn't speak, but her eyes, wide and restless, darted along the shoreline, searching for a witness, a flicker of movement, anyone who might care enough to question the scene unfolding in the brazen light of day. The taller officer, Evan Richter, had a face carved from indifference. He glanced over his shoulder at the empty gravel path leading back to the road, then tightened his grip on Amara's arm. His fingers left pale, bloodless marks on her dark skin. A few yards away, the lake lapped gently against the dock's mossy posts, a soft, insistent whisper that offered a warning no one was meant to hear. "You can't do this," Amara said. Her voice was a tremor, but it held a core of steel that cut through the bright, warm air. The shorter officer, Cole Massey, shifted his weight. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, and he kept wiping his palm on his uniform pants. He offered a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, a twitch of muscle beneath a face shadowed by his cap. "Nobody's here to see, sweetheart," he said, the words curling out like smoke from a fire that had long since turned toxic. Amara dug her heels in, a small, desperate act of defiance. But their hands, moving in practiced unison, clamped down on her shoulders, propelling her forward until the toes of her sneakers met the very edge of the boards. The water below was a darker shade of blue now, deep and cold, and the faint, swampy scent of algae rose to meet her. Richter bent down, pretending to check the cuffs. It was a piece of theater for an audience of none. His real purpose was to place a firm, broad palm against her shoulder blade and press. Amara twisted, her breath a sharp gasp in the quiet air. But Massey had moved behind her, his bulk making the old boards groan. A lone hawk circled high overhead, its cry sharp and sudden, a punctuation mark in the stillness. In that instant they shoved. The splash was an explosion of sound that shattered the afternoon's peace, sending a spray of diamond-bright droplets into the sunlight. For a heartbeat, Amara's head broke the surface, her dark, coily hair fanning out like black silk. "Help!" she gasped, a single word swallowed by the vastness of the lake. Richter stepped to the edge, his face impassive. Without hesitation, he brought the heel of his polished boot down on her head, forcing her back under. His gaze was fixed and distant, as though he were performing a mundane task, like stamping out a cigarette. Beneath the surface, a frantic, silent ballet unfolded. Amara's limbs flailed, sending up a frantic scatter of bubbles that rose and broke in the sunlight. The muffled thump of her body, striking the wooden posts, carried faintly to the shore. The water, a shimmering curtain of green and gold, closed over her, swallowing her movements, erasing her struggle until there was nothing left but the dance of light and shadow on the surface. Massey crouched to watch, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, a stark contrast to the cool air coming off the lake. He glanced toward the tree-line again, a nervous tick, and when no one appeared, he gave a short, sharp nod to Richter. Together they stood still, 2 statues in uniform, watching the ripples smooth out, watching the lake reclaim its serenity as if nothing had happened. Their breathing was heavy in the sudden, profound quiet. For a full minute, Neither spoke. The dock creaked softly as they shifted their weight. "It's done," Richter finally said. It wasn't a question. It was a final statement of fact, a closing entry in a ledger only they could read. Massey reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, silver key. He twirled it between his fingers, the metal glinting, before slipping it back into his jacket. "She won't be found," he replied, his voice striving for a casualness that it couldn't quite achieve. It was as if the act had been no more consequential than tossing a stone into the water. The lake, as if complicit, reflected the bright, cloudless sky without a single trace of the life that had just been extinguished beneath it. Far across the water, a boat engine started, its sound faint and steady, oblivious to the crime that had just stained these waters. If anyone had walked down the gravel path just then, they would have seen nothing more than two Oakhaven police officers standing on a dock, their shadows stretching long over the water. They might have noticed the way Richter kept his hands buried deep in his pockets, or how Massey's gaze kept drifting to the spot where the last ripple had vanished. But they would not have known about the weight that now rested on the muddy bottom of Serenity Lake, nor the breath that had been stolen in broad daylight. The air felt thick with something unspoken, as if the very sunlight had dimmed just enough to notice. The quiet between the trees seemed to lean in closer, holding its own dark witness to what had been done. The officers turned at last, their boots thudding back along the boards toward the shore. With each step, the distance between them and the water seemed to grow heavier, a psychic anchor pulling at their heels. The hawk that had circled earlier now landed on the dock's far end, pecking idly at a scrap of rope, a silent, feathered mockery of the ease with which a life had been discarded. By the time they reached their patrol car, parked beneath the wide, leafy arms of a sycamore tree, their faces had returned to the blank, unreadable masks they wore in town. Richter started the engine. Massey leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment, as if to block out even the thought of what lay behind them. Yet somewhere, unseen beneath that clear, placid surface, a story had begun that would not end with silence. The lake might keep its secrets for a time, but water has a way of carrying truth, of pulling it toward the surface when least expected. And though no one stood on that shore to witness the final seconds of Amara Vance's life, the wrong done here would echo far beyond these trees, carried on the current toward a reckoning neither man could yet imagine. The sun climbed higher, warm and indifferent, as if daring the world to notice the darkness that had just taken root in the brightest part of the day. Kaelan Kai Vance was in the meticulously organized maintenance bay of the Coast Guard station, calibrating the oxygen sensor on a closed-circuit rebreather when his phone began to buzz. It was tucked away in his locker, the vibration a muffled but persistent intrusion into the bay's symphony of clanging tools and easy conversation. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another automated shift change notification. But something in the rhythm of the vibration felt different, urgent, as if the device itself understood the gravity of the message it held. When he finally answered, the voice on the other end was frayed, torn apart by a panic that needed no introduction. It was Mrs. Gable, their elderly next-door neighbor. "They took her, Kai," she gasped, each word a physical blow. "Two cops. Broad daylight. Kai, they drowned her in the lake." For a moment, the world tilted. The concrete floor seemed to fall away, and the air in the bay thickened, becoming heavy and unbreathable. Kai gripped the edge of a steel workbench, his knuckles turning white. The familiar sound around him, his colleagues joking, the hiss of a pressure washer, the distant squawk of a radio, all blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. He asked Mrs. Gable to repeat it, not because he hadn't heard, but because his mind, trained to process crisis with cold logic, refused to accept this one. The same words came again, each one heavier than the last, each one dragging him deeper into a nightmare reality. At Serenity Lake, they just pushed her in. Kai had pulled strangers from the clutches of storm-tossed seas and the black, crushing depths of underwater caves. He had brought life back with steady hands and the precise administration of oxygen, his mind a fortress of calm against the chaos. But nothing in his years as an elite maritime search and rescue diver had prepared him for the image now searing itself into his brain. His sister's face, her bright, defiant smile, vanishing beneath the placid surface of their hometown lake while the sun shone overhead. His free hand clenched into a fist so tight the tendons ached. For a long, silent beat, he just listened to the sound of Mrs. Gable's ragged breathing on the line, a fragile thread connecting him to the wreckage of his life. Finally, he spoke, his voice unervingly quiet. "I'm coming home." The drive began in a blur. He didn't remember packing. His duffel bag, tossed into the back seat of his worn-out pickup, was only half-zipped, a t-shirt spilling out. The road stretched ahead, a pale ribbon of asphalt flanked by pine and oak trees that swayed lazily in the summer air, a cruel, beautiful contrast to the firestorm building in his chest. Each mile marker he passed was a heartbeat, steady and relentless. The needle on the speedometer crept higher, into territory he rarely visited. He thought of Amara's laugh, a sound like wind chimes. He remembered how she used to wait for him on that very dock after his high school swim practices, her bare feet dangling just above the water, the setting sun turning her hair into a halo of bronze. The thought of that same water closing over her, not in a playful splash, but in a final, brutal act of violence because someone in a uniform decided she was less than human, made his vision tighten at the edges. He stopped only once, at a grimy gas station on the edge of some forgotten town, long enough to fill the tank and grab a bottle of water he would never drink. The attendant, an older man with sun-leathered skin and weary eyes, glanced at him twice, perhaps sensing the coiled, dangerous energy in the way Kai moved. "Hot one today," the man offered. Kai only nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if it were a finish line he had to cross. Back on the road, he passed rusting barns and abandoned billboards that once promised better futures, each one a silent monument to decay. The landscape blurred, but his mind snagged on every small, sharp memory of his sister. The way she danced barefoot in their mother's kitchen while cooking, the scent of the lavender soap she always used, the quiet, unyielding defiance in her eyes whenever someone tried to make her feel small. Hours bled into one another. The sky began to shift, the brilliant blue of afternoon deepening into the bruised purple of twilight as the sun slid westward. Kai felt no fatigue, only a sharpening of purpose, a honing of grief into a fine, sharp point. He kept replaying Mrs. Gable's account, imagining the walk to the dock, the feel of the rough wood under Amara's feet, the sound of her voice before it was stolen by the lake. He tried to picture the faces of the men who did it, try to fix them in his mind like coordinates on a search grid. Somewhere between the sprawling fields and the dark stretches of forest, he began to understand. This was no longer just about grief. It was about something larger, something that had been rotting in the bones of Oakhaven for as long as he could remember. When he finally crossed the county line, the air itself seemed to change. The roads narrowed. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of shadows. The signs for familiar places began to appear. Miller's Grocery, the post office where Amara had worked one summer. Everything looked the same, and yet it was all diminished, tainted by the knowledge of what had happened here. Pulling into his mother's driveway, Kai sat for a moment with the engine running, staring at the front porch. He could almost see Amara there, waving him goodbye the last time he'd left, her smile a beacon. The image dissolved into the empty wooden steps. His mother met him at the door. Her face was a mask of drawn, pale grief, her hands gripping the doorframe as if to hold herself upright. No words passed between them at first. They stood locked in a silence that spoke of a shared pain too deep for language. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. They said she resisted arrest. They said she slipped. Kai shook his head slowly, a bitter taste filling his mouth. "They're lying," he said, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. The house was dim, the curtains half drawn against the dying light. The air smelled faintly of the flowers someone had already left on the dining table. He sat at the kitchen counter, the same spot where Amara used to do her homework, and felt the edges of his resolve harden into something cold and unbreakable. That night, sleep was a stranger. Lying on the narrow bed in his childhood room, he stared at the ceiling as the familiar sounds of the town filtered in through the open window. A car engine idling down the street, a dog barking, the low hum of voices from a neighbor's porch. In the suffocating darkness, his mind kept circling back to a single, immutable truth. The law in this town would not protect him, just as it had not protected her. Whatever justice was going to be done, it would have to come from his own hands. As the first thin, gray light of morning crept across the ceiling, Kai knew the road he had driven today was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of one, a journey that would take him into the darkest depths and demand from a price he was already willing to pay. The memorial service was held at the scene of the crime, a decision that felt both sacred and profane. The lake lay still under the noon sun, its surface a mirror so clear and bright it seemed to deny that anything dark had ever touched its waters. And yet, every person gathered on the grassy shore could feel the oppressive weight of what it held. The wooden dock, weathered and gray, stretched out into the water like an accusation, pointing toward the center, a place no one dared to look at for too long. A cluster of folding chairs formed a somber half-circle on the lawn, their thin metal legs sinking into the damp earth. In the middle sat a small table draped with a white cloth. On it, inside a clear glass box, lay a single object, a delicate foot anklet, hand-woven from hemp cord and threaded with tiny, iridescent seashells. It was the one Amara had made last summer, the one she never took off. The bright shells seemed too alive for the occasion, as if the moment the glass was lifted, they might still carry the warmth of her skin. A few yards away, someone had set a bouquet of white water lilies to drift on the lake, each bloom spinning slowly in the gentle current, as if being pulled towards something unseen. Kai stood at the edge of the gathering, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a dark suit he hadn't worn in years. The fabric was warm under the sun, but his skin was chilled, a cold that radiated from the inside out. The murmurs of the crowd rose and fell like a tide, words too soft to catch but heavy with the kind of grief that bends the spine and dulls the eyes. His mother sat in the front row, her gaze fixed on the anklet, her fingers gripping the edges of her chair until her knuckles whitened. When the pastor began to speak, his voice carried in steady, practiced tones. He spoke of mercy and forgiveness, of life as a river that flows to the sea. But for Kai, each phrase was a dead leaf drifting past a stone, unable to catch hold. He could not forgive. He would not forget. At one point, an older man from the neighborhood stepped forward to share a memory, his voice cracking as he described the way Amara had once helped him pull his small boat from the shallows during a sudden storm. A few people smiled through their tears, nodding in quiet agreement. But Kai kept his eyes on the water. He imagined the weight of it pressing down, the way it must have blurred her vision and stolen the air from her lungs. The image was so sharp, so visceral, that he had to take a slow step back, steadying himself. "You all right, son?" someone behind him asked, a hand brushing his shoulder. He gave the smallest of nods without turning. The sound of the lilies bumping gently against each other carried faintly to the shore, a soft, hollow rhythm that matched the steady, cold beat in his chest. When the service ended, people moved forward to lay flowers on the table, their shadows stretching long over the grass as the sun edged westward. Kai waited until the line had thinned, until only a few murmured voices remained by the dock. Then he stepped forward. The anklet in the glass box caught the light, and for a moment, the shells seemed to glow, as if some small part of her spirit still resisted the dark. He placed his hand flat against the cool glass, feeling the barrier between him and the last thing she had touched. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, each word shaped with deliberate, chilling care. "They took your breath," he said, speaking to the memory, to the water, to himself. "I'll take theirs." There was no tremor, no raised volume, just the quiet, immense weight of a promise being carved into stone. A few heads turned at the sound, but no one spoke. His mother, now standing a few steps behind him, reached for his arm, but he didn't move. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of lake water and cut grass, and somewhere a bird let out a sharp call that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Kai straightened, letting his hand fall from the glass. He turned and walked toward the dock. The boards creaked under his shoes as he walked to its farthest point, where the view opened wide across the lake. From here, the water looked endless, but he knew its secrets. He knew exactly where the depth fell away sharply, where the current curled in slow, lazy circles around the secrets it kept. He was already mapping it, not as a place of mourning, but as a field of operation. He noted the angle of the sun, the clarity of the water, the placement of the pilings. His grief was being channeled, refined, weaponized. He stood there for a long moment, the sun pressing against the back of his neck, his eyes tracing the ripples until they smoothed again into that deceptive calm. He thought of the officers, their faces impassive as they walked away, their uniforms still crisp. He pictured their lives continuing without pause, eating at familiar diners, laughing with people who either didn't know or didn't care. The thought settled over him like a stone, heavy but solid, something he could hold on to. Behind him, the voices of the remaining mourners began to fade as they made their way to their cars. Doors opened and closed, engines starting one by one. Kai stayed where he was, staring at the point where sky met water. In the silence that followed, he felt something shift inside him. It was not a burst of rage, but a steady, rooted certainty. By the time he turned back toward the shore, the grass was empty except for the table with the anklet and a few chairs left scattered in the sun. His mother waited by the path, her eyes red, but her posture straight. When he reached her, she simply said, "It's time to go home, Kai." He nodded, falling in a step beside her, but his gaze lingered over his shoulder at the lake. In the glint of the afternoon light, it looked almost peaceful again, but Kai knew better. He knew that calm could be the surface of something waiting, something that would rise when the right hand stirred the depths. And as they walked away, he carried with him the unshakable truth that this place had become more than a scene of loss. It had become the first marker on a path he was already walking, one that would not end until the water's balance was restored. The fishing dock at the far end of the county was a place of deliberate quiet, smelling of warm wood, drying nets, and the faint metallic tang of fish guts. Sunlight glared off the lake, turning every ripple into a blinding shard of light. Officer Evan Richter stood near the edge, a filleting knife in one hand and the half-clean body of a base in the other. His boots left dark, scuffed marks on the sun-bleached boards. He was humming something low and tuneless under his breath, the casual sound of a man who believed himself to be completely alone and untouchable. A plastic cooler sat open beside him, a few cans of beer sweating in the heat, one already half empty near his foot. From the shadowed depths directly below, Kai rose silently through the water. The black neoprene of his dive suit made him a phantom, blending seamlessly with the lake's murky green. Every movement was slow, precise, honed by years of navigating treacherous currents and zero visibility conditions. The surface shimmered above him, warping the shape of the man on the dock into something distorted and fragile. Kai could hear the faint scrape of the knife against the fish's scales, the soft pop of a beer can being opened. His heartbeat was a slow, steady drum, not from calm, but from absolute focus. He knew exactly how long a man could fight for breath. He knew the precise moment panic would override training, how it tightened the muscles and made the lungs burn with a fire that could only be quenched by submission. He carried that knowledge now like a surgeon carries a scalpel. Richter set the fish down, grunting as he bent to grab another beer. In that instant of distraction, Kai exploded from the water. He breached the surface in a spray of water and shadow, a creature born of the lake itself. Richter had just enough time for his eyes to widen in disbelief before Kai's hands closed around his ankles. The grip was iron. Kai yanked hard, a single, brutal motion that buckled Richter's knees and sent him sprawling forward. The knife clattered to the boards, spinning once before sliding toward the edge. Before Richter could even shout, Kai was on him, not with a clumsy tackle, but with the calculated leverage of a professional. He used the slick fish guts on the boards as a slip plate, driving Richter's head into a wooden piling with a sickening thud. The fight was short, brutal, and one-sided. Kai hooked an arm under Richter's chin, neutralized his flailing arms, and dragged him off the edge of the dock. The lake swallowed them with a violent splash that seemed to echo against the silent trees, sending a flock of startled birds up from the shallows. Underwater, the world became a muffled, chaotic blur. Richter's shouts turned into streams of desperate bubbles that rushed upward and burst silently in the sunlight. He clawed at Kai's forearm, his eyes wide and wild with the terror he had so casually inflicted on another. But Kai's hold was unbreakable. He locked an arm across Richter's chest, pinning him, and kicked them both deeper toward the colder, darker part of the lake where the bottom dropped away into blackness. Kai could feel the man's chest heaving against his arm, the desperate, futile pull for air that would never come. It wasn't rage that guided him now, but something colder, more methodical. This was a procedure. He was a force of nature, an instrument of the very water Richter had defiled. Richter's struggle weakened, his limbs slowing as the last pockets of air escaped him in a final, ghostly plume. Kai held him there for a few seconds longer, watching the moment the fight went out of his eyes, the moment his body went slack and heavy. Then, with a controlled release, he let him go. The weight of Richter's boots and waterlogged uniform dragged him down into the shadows. Kai stayed where he was for another breath, watching the figure disappear completely before he kicked toward the surface. He broke through into the hot glare of daylight. The sounds of the world returned all at once. The whisper of water against the dock, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of a motorboat far down the shore. He pulled himself onto the dock, the boards warm under his palms, and sat for a moment with his back to the sun, letting the water drain from his suit. His breathing was steady, but his muscles thrummed with the memory of the struggle. The filleting knife lay a few feet away, its blade glinting dully. He picked it up, turned it once in his hand, and then tossed it into the cooler with a half-clean fish. From Richter's belt, he unclipped the officer's badge, the metal cold and heavy in his palm. He slipped it into a waterproof pouch on his own belt. A trophy, a marker. Somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked. Kai tensed, but no one appeared. The dock felt like an island, cut off from the rest of the world. And for the first time since he had returned to Oakhaven, he felt the scales of justice tip, ever so slightly, back toward balance. He stood, glancing once more at the water. The surface had already smoothed over, as if it had not just taken a life. The sun flashed against it, a brilliant, deceptive sheen hiding the darkness below. He thought about how easily people accept what they cannot see. A fisherman disappears. They'll say he slipped. Maybe had too much to drink. Maybe the lake was just unlucky that day. But Kai knew the truth. And now, so did the water. He walked back along the dock, the wood creaking under his weight. By the time he reached the shore, his mind had already moved on to the next name, the next face, the next debt that needed to be paid in full. The courthouse steps in Oakhaven baked under the midday sun, the pale stone almost blinding where it caught the light. The air shimmered faintly above the asphalt of the small parking lot, thick with heat and unspoken tension. At the top of the landing stood Sheriff Brody Thorne, broad-shouldered and imposing in his tan uniform, a pair of dark, impenetrable sunglasses hiding his eyes. Below him, a cluster of local reporters gathered like gulls on a patch of beach, their microphones jutting forward, their cords snaking back into the small crowd. Kai watched from across the street. He leaned against the shaded brick wall of a shuttered cafe, his reflection a faint but clear silhouette in the dusty window behind him. Sheriff Thorne raised one gloved hand for silence, a gesture of practiced authority. The low hum of voices stilled instantly. He spoke in the gravelly, reassuring tone he reserved for town meetings, a voice meant to project calm and control. To Kai, it rang with the hollow falseness of a cracked bell. "We believe the unfortunate passing of Officer Richter to be a tragic accident," Thorne said, his mouth forming each syllable with deliberate weight. At this time, there is no evidence to suggest foul play. He was a good officer and a dedicated family man. The community is in mourning. The words landed with the dull thud of a hammer on rotten wood, each one designed to close a door, not open one. A few of the reporters shifted, exchanging glances that mixed skepticism with a weary resignation. This was the Oakhaven way. A young woman near the front, her face earnest and determined, tried to press further. "Sheriff, what about the eyewitness from the marina who claims he heard a struggle? And what about the fact that Officer Richter was an expert swimmer?" Before she could finish, Thorne cut her off with a raised palm, a gesture that was both dismissive and menacing. His jaw tightened just enough for Kai to notice from across the street. Kai could read that kind of body language as easily as he could read water currents. The sheriff wasn't just answering questions, he was drawing a line. He was signaling, in that quiet way powerful men do, that pressing too hard would come with a cost. It was a language of control, sharpened over decades of holding power in a place small enough for fear to travel faster than truth. Kai felt his teeth clench, not from surprise. He had expected nothing less, but from the bitter confirmation that the rot in this town didn't stop with the two men on the dock. It flowed from the top down. Thorne was the gatekeeper, the man who could turn daylight into shadow with nothing more than a sentence and the right people standing behind him. A delivery truck rumbled past, its tires grinding over loose gravel, and the sound briefly swallowed the sheriff's voice. When it faded, Kai heard him wrapping up the statement, offering a few platitudes about moving forward and letting the community heal. Those words made Kai's skin prickle. They weren't about healing. They were about forgetting. About closing the book before the truth could stain its pages. He glanced at the notepad of a reporter nearby, catching the neat block letters of her notes. He wondered how much of it would survive the editing room, how much of the skepticism would be sanded down into compliant reporting. Thorne stepped back from the microphones, adjusting the brim of his hat. A deputy moved forward to corral the press toward the bottom steps. Kai remained in the shadow, his breathing slow and even, watching the way the sheriff's lips tightened when the crowd didn't disperse quickly enough. In the heavy summer air, the smell of exhaust mixed with the faint scent of hot tar, and the heat seemed to press down on the square like a physical weight. A pair of older men leaned against the hood of a pickup truck across the lot, talking in low voices, their eyes flicking between the reporters and the courthouse door. Everyone here was watching someone else, and everyone was being watched. Kai let his gaze drift to the wide double doors at the top of the steps, their brass handles gleaming. He remembered walking through them as a boy with his father, back when he still believed a courthouse was a place where truth rose to the surface like a diver from the depths. Now he knew better. Truth didn't rise on its own. It had to be dragged up, sometimes kicking and screaming, and too often it was weighted down again before it could ever speak. The sheriff disappeared inside, the cool shadow of the building swallowing his broad frame. The doors swung closed with a finality that seemed to echo off the buildings around the square. Kai stayed a while longer, long enough to see the reporters drift back to their cars, their voices blending into the lazy hum of the afternoon. He stepped away from the cafe window, crossing the street without hurry, his hands in his pockets. The stone steps radiated heat through the soles of his boots. For a moment, he stood where the sheriff had stood, looking down at the empty space where the crowd had been. It was a small thing, but it gave him a different perspective, the perspective of a man like Thorne, looking down on the people he only pretended to serve. A faint breeze picked up, rustling the flags that hung limp against the courthouse facade. Kai turned away, heading back down toward the narrow side street where he had parked. He could feel the shape of his resolve settling deeper, becoming something more than anger. It was becoming patient, exacting. The sheriff's words had been meant to close a door. But for Kai, they had only marked it. Now he knew which handle he would have to turn next. And when the time came, he intended to make sure it opened onto something the sheriff could not control. The reservoir sat calm under the afternoon sun, its wide expanse glinting like a sheet of polished steel. Near the center, a lone fishing boat drifted, a tiny speck in the vastness. On its deck, Officer Cole Massey lay back, one arm flung over his eyes to block the glare, the other holding a sweating can of beer that tilted lazily in his hand. Country music, tinny and cheerful, crackled from a small portable radio beside him. The notes carried faintly across the water, mixing with the gentle slap of waves against the hull. He looked every bit the man without a care in the world. But Kai knew better. Massey was the lookout. The man who had stood with folded arms on the dock at Serenity Lake, while Amara's life was pushed under and kept there. The silent accomplice. The kind of man who didn't need to get his hands wet to be soaked in guilt. From the wooded shoreline, Kai had been watching for nearly an hour. His dive gear was stowed in a black duffel at his feet, his eyes fixed on the boat's slow, aimless path. Timing was everything. Too soon, and Massey might make it to shore. Too late, and he might drift out of reach. When the boat's bow finally turned toward the deepest part of the reservoir, Kai slipped into the water without a splash. The cool weight of the lake closed over him like a second skin. His body moved with practiced efficiency, arms pulling and legs kicking in a silent, powerful rhythm, each stroke taking him closer to the drifting shape above. The sunlight filtered down in shifting, ethereal beams, painting the underside of the hull in shades of gold and green. He kept his eyes on the thick rope trailing from the stern, disappearing into the shadowy depths below. Reaching it, Kai pulled a small, serrated dive knife from his belt. In one smooth, powerful motion, he sliced through the anchor line. The tension released with a subtle shudder that traveled up the rope. The boat, now untethered, began to drift more freely, carried by the slow, invisible current toward the center of the deep. He surfaced briefly at the far side of the hull, careful to keep his head low, his breaths measured and quiet. Massey hadn't moved. He was still stretched out in the sun, one leg bent at the knee, the radio warbling on about lost love and dirt roads. Kai waited. He let the boat drift for another 10 minutes, well past the point where the shoreline was anything more than a dark green smudge. Then, he pulled himself up over the side in one fluid, silent motion, his wet suit gleaming like sealskin in the harsh light. The shadow that fell over Massey made him stir. His arm lifted from his face, confusion knitting his brow. "What the?" he began, the words slurring slightly from the beer. The words cut short when Kai looped a length of steel cable around his ankle and snapped a heavy-duty carabiner shut. The sudden, cold bite of metal made Massey jerk upright, his beer spilling across the deck. His eyes, now wide with shock and dawning horror, fixed on Kai's impassive face. "Hey man, what is this? Who are you?" he barked, scrambling backward. Kai didn't answer. He simply grabbed the loose end of the cable, which was secured to a heavy, discarded engine block he had planted on the lake bed earlier that day. He stepped back toward the edge of the boat, his movements calm, deliberate. The moment Massey tried to scramble away, Kai yanked hard. The man toppled over the side, hitting the water with a heavy splash that sent the boat rocking violently. The cable went taut instantly, pulling Massey downward into the green, silent shadows. Kai leaned over the edge, watching. The surface churned with Massey's frantic kicks, the foam breaking apart into smaller and smaller bursts. His arms thrashed upward, his mouth opening in a soundless plea that only produced more bubbles. Kai could see the raw panic taking hold, the way the man's movements became sharper, more desperate, then slower as the oxygen drained from his muscles. For a moment, their eyes met through the distorting lens of the water. In that gaze, there was no recognition of shared humanity, only the cold, hard ledger of what was owed and what was being collected. The struggle didn't last long. Soon, the cable hung slack in the water, swaying gently with the current. The surface of the reservoir settled back into its glassy calm. Kai pulled the cable in slowly, unclipped the carabiner from the now empty loop, and let the steel sink back into the deep. The radio still played on the deck, oblivious, its cheerful chorus rising against the stark, profound silence of the reservoir. Kai sat for a moment on the edge of the boat, breathing in the hot, dry air. He felt the contrast of his sun on his face and the cool dampness of his suit. Far off, a heron lifted into the sky, its great wings casting a brief shadow over the water before it disappeared. He started the small outboard motor and steered the boat back toward the shore, keeping his path steady, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching from the banks, it would look like a quiet afternoon fisherman heading in early, perhaps tired of the heat or unlucky with the catch. But Kai carried the weight of another step completed. Another name crossed off the list. The steady hum of the motor seemed to pulse in time, with the resolve settling deeper in his chest. As the shoreline came closer and the details of the land sharpened in the sunlight, he knew exactly where he would go next and exactly what he would do when he got there. In the days that followed, the town of Oakhaven seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't the peace that comes from rest. It was the tense, humming quiet that precedes a storm. At the corner cafe, the usual morning chatter had dulled to murmurs, and the clink of coffee cups seemed to echo in the absence of easy laughter. In the barber shop, men sat longer in the chairs after their haircuts were finished, talking in low tones, their eyes glancing toward the door each time the bell chimed. There was a new weight in the air, invisible but thick enough to feel, pressing on everyone who had lived there long enough to understand the town's unspoken language. Kai moved through these spaces like a shadow, not hiding, but never lingering in the center of the room. He would stand in line at Miller's grocery and feel eyes on his back, not with open recognition, but with the cautious unease of someone sensing an unfamiliar, powerful current in a familiar stream. In the evenings, he would walk the length of Main Street, watching the warm glow from shop windows fade as owners turned their signs to closed, each glass door reflecting him back in fractured, passing images. People would still nod when he passed, but their smiles were thin, more a reflex of small-town habit than a genuine welcome. It was as if the town itself had decided to wait, to see which way the wind would turn. At the hardware store, a man named Henderson, an old friend of his father's, caught his arm near the shelves of rope and hooks. The man's eyes darted to the empty aisle before he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard about Richter," he said, then paused. "And Massey." Kai studied his face, the lines cut deep by years of sun and worry. He saw no accusation there, but something closer to a grim, reluctant respect. Or maybe it was relief. Kai didn't answer. He simply placed the coil of rope he'd been holding back on the shelf and walked away. Henderson didn't follow, but when Kai glanced over his shoulder from the front of the store, he saw the old man still standing there, arms crossed, watching. Even in places where no one spoke to him directly, Kai could feel the story moving through the town like water through unseen pipes. A look exchanged between a cashier and a customer. The way a conversation in the diner would stall for a beat when he walked past the window. All of it told him that word had spread further than he had expected. But this wasn't the kind of gossip that bloomed into open talk. It was the kind that dug down, burrowed into the quiet, resentful places and waited. It wasn't fear of him that kept him silent. It was fear of the people who might be next on his list, and a deeper fear of the system that still had its hands around the throat of this place. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of burnt copper, Kai stopped by Serenity Lake. The water was calm, reflecting the darkening sky in broken ripples. The cicadas sang their droning, electric song in the trees along the shore. He stood at the dock where his sister had been taken, hands in his pockets, listening to the sounds of the town just beyond the tree line. A car door closing, a screen door creaking open, a child's laugh quickly hushed. It was enough to remind him that life was still moving here, even if it moved differently now. He thought about the people watching from behind their curtains, wondering how close they could let themselves stand to the truth without being pulled under with it. Later, as he walked back toward his truck, a woman stepped out from the narrow alley between the bait shop and the laundromat. She was small, her gray hair tied back, and her eyes met his without hesitation. "I know what you're doing," she said softly, stating a fact, not making an accusation. Kai waited. She only added, "Be careful. They watch everybody, but they'll watch you harder now." He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and she stepped back into the shadows as if she had never been there. That night, Kai sat in his mother's kitchen. The rich smell of brewed coffee filled the air, the only light coming from the small lamp above the sink. His mother didn't ask where he had been, but she studied his face with the kind of gaze that reached past words, a mother's inventory of a son's soul. "This isn't over, is it?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. Kai shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark window where his own reflection stared back. "No," he said. The single word carried more weight than its syllable should have held. She didn't press further. She turned back to her coffee, and the silence between them settled into something both heavy and understood. In the days ahead, the whispers would keep moving, winding their way through the market, the gas station, the church pews on Sunday morning. Oakhaven wasn't ready to speak out loud. Not yet, but Kai knew it was coming. Silence can only hold for so long before it cracks. And when it did, the flood that followed would wash more than just names into the open. Until then, he would keep moving through the quiet, reading the glances, listening to the pauses, and letting the weight of their unspoken truths guide him to the next shadow he needed to step into. Judge Alistair Finch's lake house sat at the far edge of town, a monument to insulated privilege hidden behind tall, manicured hedges and a wrought iron gate that creaked with expensive quiet. It was the kind of place built to keep the world at a distance. Its perfect lawn rolled down to a private, multi-level dock, and the water beyond glinted in the late afternoon sun. From the shadows of the tree-line, Kai could hear the faint hum of conversation drifting across the yard, punctuated by the sharp, brittle bursts of forced laughter. The smell of grilled steak carried on the breeze, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and expensive perfume. The clink of ice in heavy glass tumblers marked the lazy rhythm of an easy summer gathering. He watched the guests scattered across the sprawling deck, their bright, pastel clothes catching the light like flashes of signal flags. Judge Finch stood near a massive, stainless steel grill, tall and broad-shouldered, his crisp white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. In one hand, he held a tumbler of amber liquid. With the other, he gesticulated grandly, telling a story that made the small, sycophantic group around him laugh on cue. Kai felt no rush. He had waited this long. The sun was still high enough to keep the dock well lit. Patience was as much a part of his work now as precision. From where he stood, he traced the line of the dock down to where it met the water. He had scouted it days before. He noted the warped plank near the middle, the one whose support joist was already showing signs of rot. That would be the spot. He moved only when a pair of guests wandered back toward the house, their voices fading into the general hum. Crossing the lawn with steady, unhurried steps, he reached the start of the dock. The boards were warm under his boots. The water lapped gently against the posts, and the smell of algae rose in faint, warm waves. He paused, letting the scene behind him fade to a low blur, then reached into the small pouch at his side. The tool in his hand was simple, a small, powerful crowbar, its metal worn smooth from use. He slid its tip under the chosen plank, working it loose, applying just enough pressure to crack the supporting joist beneath. The sound was barely more than a groan of stressed wood, lost in the chatter from the deck and the sizzle of the grill. When he stepped back onto the grass, Judge Finch had left his post and was making his way toward the dock, a fresh drink in hand, ready to hold court from his waterfront throne. Kai watched as the man took in the view, the relaxed, proprietary tilt of his head, the slight narrowing of his eyes against the sunlight. The judge walked the length of the dock with the easy confidence of someone who believed every inch of it, and the world it sat on belonged to him. Halfway down, his polished loafer pressed onto the weakened plank. The wood gave way with a sharp, violent crack that sliced through the party's ambient noise. The sound was followed by the heavy splash of his body hitting the water. There was a moment of stunned silence from the guests, a collective intake of breath, as if they were waiting for the scene to resolve itself into a harmless, drunken stumble. Then came the shouts. Chairs scraped against the deck. Hurried footsteps thudded toward the edge. Finch's head broke the surface once, his face a mask of shock and outrage. His arms thrashed, but the splintered plank had snagged his trousers, twisting his leg at an unnatural angle and holding him fast. Kai stepped onto the dock, blending seamlessly with a rush of people. As he passed the spot, he stumbled, his hand closing briefly on the judge's shoulder, pushing him back under with a force that was masked by the surrounding chaos. The water swallowed the man in a swirl of bubbles and churning water. Kai felt the fight drain from him quickly, the arrogance replaced by a frantic animal panic. By the time someone shouted for a rope, Finch's body had already begun to sink, the last glint of sunlight on his expensive watch disappearing into the green, murky depths. Guests leaned precariously over the dock, calling his name, their voices growing sharper with fear. Kai stayed at the edge, his face a perfect mask of concern that revealed nothing of the cold satisfaction within. A younger man, full of bravado and whiskey, dove in, kicking up a great spray of water. He resurfaced seconds later, gasping, shaking his head. "He's gone. I can't see him. He's just gone under," he choked out, and the air around the dock filled with the sound of panicked instructions and clumsy, useless searches. Kai stepped back onto the grass, the scene dissolving into frantic motion behind him. He moved toward the gate with the same calm steps he had arrived with, the voices growing fainter as the hedge swallowed the view. At the road, he glanced once over his shoulder. He could see the dock framed against the bright water, the cluster of brightly dressed people leaning dangerously over the side, as if sheer will might pull the man back from the depths. But the lake, like all lakes, kept what was given. The drive back toward town was quiet, the tires humming against the blacktop, the late sun sliding lower with each mile. Kai's mind was steady. The memory of the judge's face in those last moments was already fading, joining the long line of images he carried. This was never about spectacle. It was about balance. It was about making sure the same water that had taken his sister would take those who had helped bury the truth beneath layers of legal deceit. In his side mirror, the glint of the lake vanished behind a curve in the road. The horizon ahead stretched open, wide, and waiting. The press conference was staged at the lakeside park, on the very same public dock where Amara's memorial had been held. The choice of location was a deliberate act of political theater by Sheriff Thorne, an attempt to reclaim the narrative, to project authority over the very ground that held the town's deepest wound. A makeshift podium stood on the dock, draped in a banner bearing the county seal, flanked by two stone-faced deputies. Sheriff Thorne stood in the center, his tan shirt crisply pressed, his hat pulled low, a pair of mirrored sunglasses reflecting the scene before him, hiding whatever might have been in his eyes. The crowd was larger than usual for such events. A volatile mix of townspeople, local reporters, and curious onlookers, their voices buzzing with a low, nervous energy in the heavy midday heat. Cameras were set up at angles that framed the shimmering lake just over Thorne's shoulder, its placid surface offering an almost too perfect backdrop. Kai watched from beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the boat launch. His arms were folded loosely across his chest, his expression as unreadable as the dark water. The words from the loudspeakers were clear in the still air, each syllable carrying with the practiced authority Thorne had built over decades. He spoke of safety, of community trust, of how a series of unfortunate accidents should not be allowed to divide neighbors. His tone was steady, but Kai could hear the undercurrent, the quiet insistence that the story was already written and he was merely reading it aloud. A few reporters pushed with sharper questions about Judge Finch's death, but Thorne sidestepped them with a condescending smile that never touched his mouth. The longer Kai listened, the more he could feel the hollowness in the sheriff's words, the way they rang like a church bell with no clapper. He knew that tone too well. It was the voice of a man who believed control was simply a matter of how long you could keep the truth submerged. Around the crowd, a few people shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks they didn't want noticed. It seemed they, too, heard something they couldn't quite name, but instinctively distrusted. The sun caught the edge of Thorne's sunglasses just right, flashing once in Kai's direction like a warning signal, though Thorne had no idea who stood in the shade, watching, waiting. When the sheriff paused to take a theatrical sip from a bottle of water on the podium, Kai moved. He walked along the side of the crowd, quiet but deliberate, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. He slipped down the embankment to the side of the dock, keeping low, the wooden boards above him creaking under the shuffle of shoes and the occasional adjustment of a camera tripod. The lake lapped softly against the pilings, each small wave tapping out a patient, steady rhythm. In his hand was a length of braided rope, coiled neatly, its texture rough against his palm. The podium stood at the very edge of the dock, a single step away from open water. From the shadows below, Kai reached up. He slid the pre-tied loop around one of Thorne's polished boots and tightened it with a slow, sure pull. The sheriff didn't notice. He was busy answering a question about community healing, his hands gesturing in smooth, patronizing arcs as if sculpting the air into a shape of his own choosing. Kai gave the rope a single, sharp tug. There was a startled intake of breath from the podium, the scrape of a shoe against wood, and then Sheriff Thorne pitched forward into the lake with a great splash that silenced every voice at once. The microphones caught the moment in perfect, high-fidelity clarity. The slap of water, the muffled shouts, and the collective gasp of the crowd. Kai stayed low, the dock shuddering above him as people rushed to the edge. "Get him out," someone yelled. A deputy dropped to his knees, reaching a frantic hand toward the churning water. Thorne surfaced once, coughing and sputtering, his hat gone, his sunglasses skewed. But Kai gave another sharp pull on the rope, and the sheriff went under again, his cry for help turning into a gurgle. The second submersion was longer, the ripples widening until they lapped against the dock posts where Kai crouched. By the time Thorne was hauled back onto the boards, soaked and gasping like a landed fish, the cameras were still rolling. The image of the great Sheriff Thorne on his hands and knees, water dripping from his uniform, his authority washed away, would travel farther and faster than any of his speeches ever could. Kai eased back into the shadows, slipping into the shallow water near the reeds. The sounds of chaos covered his retreat. The crowd was still shouting. Deputies were waving people back, and reporters were craning for a better view. Their lenses aimed not at the lake now, but at the man who had once commanded it with his voice alone. On the far side of the park, Kai emerged from the water, the damp clinging to his clothes. The rope was coiled once more in his hand. He walked to his truck, parked under the trees, and glanced once over his shoulder at the dock. The sheriff was still there, sitting back on his heels, his head lowered as if the weight of the water was still pressing down on him. Kai started the engine, the low rumble covering his last look at the lake before he pulled away. As the road curved toward the highway, the noise of the park faded, replaced by the hum of tires and the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder. Kai knew this wasn't the end of Thorne. Not yet. Men like him didn't crumble in one public moment. But the crack had been made. And once a crack appears, water will always find its way in. The lake had taken its first piece of him, and Kai intended to see that it wasn't the last. The bells of St. Andrew's Church began to ring across the town square, their slow, deliberate chimes cutting through the oppressive late afternoon heat. It wasn't a call to worship. It was something else, something the town hadn't heard in generations, a summons. People began to gather. They came not in a rush, but in a steady, determined trickle. Some were drawn by simple curiosity, others by a heavier feeling, a sense that the ground beneath their feet was shifting, that the quiet routine of their lives was about to break. The square filled in uneven patches. Older couples stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim. Young families lingered at the fringes, their children held close. A handful of men in dusty work boots leaned against the hoods of their pickup trucks, their arms crossed, their eyes watchful. Kai watched from the steps of the town's war memorial, his arms resting loosely at his sides as he scanned the crowd. There had been no official call to assemble, no flyers or announcements. Yet the air felt charged with an unspoken agreement. Conversations started in cautious murmurs, then grew bolder as more people arrived, the words carrying further than their speakers probably intended. "It's been going on too long," an older woman said to no one in particular, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. A man near her, His face, weathered from a life of outdoor labor, nodded. His gaze was fixed on the courthouse across the street. "People have died for less," he replied, and his words settled over the group like a slow-moving shadow. The crowd swelled as the sun began to dip, throwing long bands of gold across the old brick buildings. Kai saw black residents and white residents standing together, their usual social distances erased by the common weight of what they had all been living under. Some carried candles, unlit for now, their thin wax stems trembling slightly in the breeze. Others had rifles slung over their shoulders, not in open threat, but as a quiet, resolute statement of readiness. The sheriff's deputies, stationed discreetly at the edges of the square, kept their distance. Their eyes were alert, but their hands stayed away from their weapons. They could feel the shift, too. Kai moved through the square without urgency, blending into the shifting pockets of conversation. He listened more than he spoke, letting the words find him. A young mechanic with grease-stained hands told him about a cousin who'd been beaten senseless during a routine traffic stop. A woman in a nurse's uniform spoke quietly of medical files that had gone missing from the hospital after an unexplained death in custody years ago. These weren't confessions. They were seeds of truth, long buried in the soil of silence, finally being pushed into the open air. From the steps of the church, Reverend Coleman began to speak. His voice, deep and resonant, carried easily across the square without the need for a microphone. He didn't name names, but his words cut straight to the heart of what everyone knew. "If the law serves only the lawmen," he declared, his voice ringing off the brick facades, "then it is no longer law. It is a cage." The stillness that followed his words felt like the entire town was taking a single, collective breath. The crowd shifted, some stepping closer to hear better, others glancing toward Kai, as if searching for something in his face. Kai met their looks with the same profound calm he had carried since the day he returned. He didn't nod. He didn't raise his voice. But his very presence was an answer. In that moment, he wasn't just a man grieving his sister. He was a marker on the road they all stood upon, living proof that someone could push back against the suffocating darkness and still be standing. The idea moved through them in a way no speech could. Quiet, personal, and undeniable. As the sun slipped below the rooftops, someone lit the first candle. The small, brave flame flickered against the gathering dark. One by one, others followed suit. The square became dotted with warm, flickering light, the glow bouncing off the old brick walls and the polished metal of parked cars. The conversation softened, but didn't fade. Kai could feel the change. This was no longer just talk. This was the beginning of something that would not be easily contained. When the church bells rang again, marking the hour, the sound rolled over the crowd like a reminder that time was moving, that they could not stand still forever. Kai stepped back toward the edge of the square, letting the scene settle into his memory. The town was waking up, not in a sudden, violent rush, but in the slow, certain way that changes everything it touches. He knew the silence would not last. And when it finally broke, it would not be gentle. He turned toward the side street where his truck was parked, the candlelight behind him casting long, unbroken shadows on the pavement. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of burning wax, and something sharper, something more potent beneath it. Resolve. For the first time since he'd come home, Kai felt the weight in his chest shift. It wasn't lighter, but it was shared, and that made all the difference. The sun was high when Kai parked his truck on the gravel pull-off just beyond the county line. Serenity Lake stretched out in front of him like a sheet of molten glass. The air was warm but carried a faint, sharp bite of wind across the water, lifting small ripples that sparkled in the intense light. Down by the dock, Police Chief Declan Gallo stood with his hands on his hips, talking into a phone. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were constantly scanning the shoreline. It was the same dock, the place where it had all begun, where Amara had taken her last breath. The symmetry of it felt deliberate, fated, as if the place itself was waiting for a final balance to be restored. Kai stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He started toward the water with a steady, inexorable pace that drew no attention but allowed no doubt. Gallo ended his call and turned to face him, his brow furrowing slightly as recognition settled in his hard features. "Kaelan Vance," he said, his tone holding a faint, mocking edge. "Didn't expect to see you here. Come to pray." Kai stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on a man's face, reading the slight, arrogant twitch at the corner of his mouth. This was the architect of it all, the man who gave the orders, who cultivated the rot. "We both know why I'm here, Gallo," Kai replied, his voice even, the words measured and cold. The space between them felt heavier than the air around it, charged with everything that had gone unsaid for too long. The chief gave a short, barking laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing a child's bluff. "You think you're going to scare me? Out here, on my dock." Kai took another step forward, his boots thudding against the weathered boards. "No," he said quietly. "I think you're going to understand." His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time, Gallo's smile faltered. A small crack appeared in the shield of arrogance he wore so easily. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of algae and sun-warmed wood. The sound of water lapping against the posts filled the pause between them. Kai moved with a suddenness that erased the stillness of the moment. He closed the distance, his hand shooting out to grab Gallo by the front of his shirt. The chief, a big man but softened by years behind a desk, stumbled back. His phone slipped from his hand, skittering across the dock and spinning into the water. They grappled, a clumsy, brutal dance on the narrow planks. Boots scraped against the wood, their shadows twisting together in the harsh sunlight. Gallo swung once, a wild telegraph punch that Kai deflected, the blow glancing off his shoulder. It only fueled him. He drove them both toward the shallows, the water sloshing higher against their legs as they stumbled off the end of the dock. Gallo tried to twist free, his voice breaking into a strained bark. "You're making a mistake, boy." Kai shoved him backward into the waist-deep water. The splash echoed off the empty shore. The chief flailed, his arms churning, but Kai followed him in. The cold of the lake wrapped around his body, sharpening his focus to a razor's edge. They went under together. The sudden, profound silence of the lake enveloped them, broken only by the muted thrash of limbs and the frantic rush of bubbles toward the surface. Kai's grip was a vice, locked around Gallo's collar, dragging him deeper. The sunlight above fractured into thin, unreachable beams of hope. In the muffled green quiet, Kai could feel the fight in the other man's muscles, the frantic heave for air, the sharp pull of primal desperation. He held him there, his own lungs burning, his mind fixed on the memory of his sister's last moments in this very water. When Gallo's movements began to weaken, Kai loosened his hold just enough to let the man's head break the surface. Gallo took a single, ragged gulp of air, his eyes wild with terror. Before he could scream, Kai showed him the small, iridescent seashell he held in his palm. One he had found wedged between the planks on his first visit back, a piece of Amara's anklet. Gallo's eyes widened in recognition, and in that moment he understood. Kai pushed him under again. This time, there was less resistance. The struggle was reduced to mere spasms that faded quickly into a final, heavy stillness. Kai let go, watching as the body of the police chief sank in slow motion toward the lake bed, drifting in the muted light like a discarded mannequin. He surfaced alone, drawing in deep, steady breaths. The air tasted different, somehow cleaner, heavier, final. The dock was only a few strokes away. He pulled himself onto it, water streaming from his clothes and pooling at his feet. Gallo's phone was gone, swallowed by the lake. He stood at the edge, looking out across the water, the ripples already closing over the spot where the chief had gone under. From the shoreline, the trees swayed softly in the breeze, their leaves catching the light in flashes of green and gold. There was no sound but the wind and the gentle push of the lake against the dock's pilings. Kai felt no triumph, only the quiet, profound certainty of something completed. A weight had shifted, not just in his soul, but in the world. He knew there would be questions, an investigation. But the ultimate truth of what had happened here would stay between him and the water. He walked back to the truck, each step on the dock a slow release. The boards creaked beneath him in a rhythm that matched the steady beating in his chest. The sun was still high, the day unchanged to anyone who might pass this place later. Yet Kai knew it would never look the same to him again. As he started the engine and turned onto the narrow road leading away from the lake, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The dock was already shrinking in the distance, the water behind it flat and unbroken, holding its silence like a pact. The sun was dipping low, bleeding colors of fire and gold across the horizon, turning the surface of Serenity Lake into a wide, molten expanse. The air was still, carrying only the faint hum of insects in the grass and the distant cry of a lone bird disappearing into the treeline. Kai had not come here for ceremony or for closure, not in the way others might have expected. This was not a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement, a moment to let the quiet speak for both the living and the dead. In his hand, he held a single white lily, its stem cool and damp, the petals folded gently inward as if bracing against a wind that wasn't there. He crouched at the water's edge and set the flower on the surface. It caught a small ripple and began to drift slowly away from the shore, a solitary white vessel on a sea of darkening gold. For a long moment, Kai's gaze followed it without blinking. His reflection stretched out beside it, fractured and blurred, as if the lake was still unwilling to give him back to himself in one piece. Behind him, the sky was shifting from gold to deep amber, the light falling across his shoulders in soft, warm bands. He let his hands rest loosely at his sides, feeling the weight of everything he had done, every act of violence, every moment of cold resolve, settle into a stillness that was neither regret nor pride. It simply was. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of the water and the faint memory of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the hills. Kai closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the evening settle over him. The gentle lap of the lake against the shore, the small plunk of a fish breaking the surface, the whisper of leaves rubbing together in the trees. When he opened them again, the lily was farther out, a pale, distant spot against the darkening water. "You're free now, Amara," he said quietly, the words more for himself than for anyone who might hear. He turned and walked toward the old bench that sat under a leaning oak, its wood worn smooth by years of sun and rain. Sitting down, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his eyes scanning the line where the lake met the horizon. The air was cooler now, brushing over his skin and carrying with it the faint ache that comes only when a long-held tension finally begins to release. He thought about the faces of the men who had stood in his way, the look in their eyes when they finally realized what was coming. They had been certain the law would protect them, certain the lake would keep their secrets. They had been wrong. Somewhere behind him, footsteps approached on the gravel path, slow and hesitant. He didn't need a turn. He knew the sound. His mother came into view a moment later, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze moving from him to the water. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to fill the silence with words. Instead, she sat beside him, her presence a quiet anchor, grounding him in a way nothing else could. For a while, they just watched the lake together as the last threads of sunlight pulled away from the surface. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "It's done, isn't it?" Kai nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Yes," he said. The single syllable carried a universe of weight that neither of them needed to unpack. She reached over and placed her hand lightly on his. In that simple gesture, there was an understanding that went beyond explanation. They both knew nothing would bring Amara back, but the violent imbalance that had stolen her life had been answered. The scales had been reset. As the sky deepened into shades of violet and ink blue, Kai stood, taking one last look at the lake. The lily was no longer visible, swallowed by the distance and the falling dark. He felt no need to search for it. It was enough to know it was out there, moving freely, carried by the same water that had once been a grave. Without another word, he started back toward the path, his mother walking beside him, the sound of their footsteps merging into the quiet of the coming night. At the edge of the trees, he paused and glanced over his shoulder one final time. The lake lay still under the evening sky, holding its secrets the way it always had. But now, Kai knew that not all secrets stay buried. Some rise when the time is right, bringing with them the crushing weight of a justice that cannot be ignored. He turned away, the night air cool against his face, and stepped into the shadows of the path ahead, leaving the water to keep what it would. In the end, this was never just about revenge. It was about truth rising to the surface, no matter how long it had been held down. Kai's path was dark, but brought a dawn to Oakhaven. His actions led to a state investigation, a complete overhaul of the corrupt police department, and the creation of a citizens' oversight committee to ensure such abuses of power could never take root again. He restored a piece of balance to a place where justice had been silenced for too long. The lake became both witness and judge, holding the memory of those who had taken and those who had been taken from. What is true justice? And what is its price? Share your thoughts in the comments. Please, comment with respect. If this story spoke to you, like this video to help it reach others. Share it with someone who understands the cost of silence. And subscribe so you can walk with us through more stories that honor dignity, courage, and the fight to make things right. Because the work of justice is never truly finished. It lives on in the telling.